work for yourself.
And then we can then answer the two questions. Is it 18? It's like The Apprentice.
I'm sure no. That's why we're doing this.
And also when it's the official redaction, the religion.
Some people say stuff like this, throws things in time. In fact, yes, it is a starting point.
One is official.
Doesn't say very much. And so you're very aware
Well, it's very hard to say without telling you the answer. But the Grand Coutumier was a couturier, and that was written by.
English case law or except the same word it's not binding, but it's released. And I would say, you're going to stop there, you're going to close it down. If it's still relevant, I would check it all the way through. Yeah, I would say, I think just about it's very common to pop. That's still looking at, in fact, raw French, Scottish, English, there's nothing between them. So it just matters. For example, legal method, but it doesn't matter what we use. Are you talking about the two? Yes. Just within here, but just. Oh.
Do you have a library at home?
I do have a library.
Yeah.
Got all the core texts. Doing the amalgam to talk about. Yeah,
I used to obviously legal flying off to London for auctions to go.
Oh, right. Well, that was one great thing for the internet. You could find it.
Yeah.
I looked up the fraction of time from saying that. You can just go on age books and you can find them.
Not many.
And you say not many people can use French.
Yeah. So what's the application of those books to modern,
There's a problem, and that's the problem with reduced commas. People don't learn.
Would it?
Who's going to do it?
I don't know.
It's going to cost a lot.
Yeah, quite.
I mean, I can do it, but it's
unofficial.
All the corporates we had. French.
Try to giving a lot, but Stephen Palmer and Gregory White could do. Well, you kind of doing them to do the translation doesn't cost because you just get them to do it for free.
Right.
But then of course you've got to publish. But I suppose given that you can publish on the internet.
Yeah. Yes, that's not a problem. As I said, we've got this library online.
It's like the old
Okay, guys, so we just do the answers? Okay, so what is the difference between a coutumier and a coutume, and why is the distinction important?
Yeah, well, I suppose the coutumiers, is it that
Sorry,
side?
I thought I'd go. Oh, no, if you want to go this side.
I guess so the coutumier is like a sort of commentary on sort of crystallisation of coutume, which are the customs starting normally on pre-norm, but we were up to attack the Christophe coutumier, which was part of Frankish, Roman, and
this is what happens when we go back to Roman law. Cool.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
So, well, it's still
yes.
incorporated because it formed part of that.
So the coutumier is the
coutumier is sort of written down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the coutume and accoutume. A coutume
is the custom, so it's the sort of what in usage was the.
Not in this question. It means something more specific. Yes, I think, we are recording.
we are recording. I'll just check.
Yeah.
A coutume is the official redaction, so an official redaction means.
So the coutume is the official reduction,
Yes.
and the coutumier is an unofficial commentary.
It's an unofficial. Is that an unofficial? Also, an unofficial redaction. It's an unofficial attempt to write down what the custom is. It's the Dacian Morris of the rules of Dacian Morris of customary law. So it's attempting to try and be. Try and be encyclopedic. It's attempting to try and write down everything that you need to know, at least everything that needs to be known for the particular subject that's being dealt with at that time, because obviously the Transaction Coutumier deals with substantive far more than the Grand Coutumier. So the Grand Coutumier has 125 articles, so it is trying to be like a code, but it's a bit like if you or I was to try and write down a codified version of current Guernsey customary law. And a coutume is an official redaction, but what we're trying to tease out for official redaction, that means it's essentially a properly promulgated piece of statute. In the case of a French coutume, which inevitably, strictly speaking, they will be, it basically means a royal ordinance, so it's a law made by the king. Because in the French monarchy, it was the king who made the laws, and somebody then registered them, well, the Parlement registered them, but there was no wider legislature that was usually sitting. We needn't get in too much into French constitutional history. So why is the distinction important? That's the basic thing, but why, how does that matter? And how does it, and how might it not matter as much as it might seem in some ways? So what's the big thing about being an official redaction? The single big thing. So
You can't abrogate.
you can't abrogate it. It is law. It is a legislative act. Whereas a coutumier, if you were to look at it in sort of the modern sense, you'd say, well, this is just a text. But you'd have to also, in a sort of question, add that that's not really a realistic review of how the Grand Coutumier was viewed prior, certainly in France, prior to 1583. It's not just viewed as a text, it's viewed as a fairly definitive statement of customary law, albeit one which the parts can fall by the wayside far more readily. It can be abrogated, but it's not just somebody's persuasive article. on something. And of course it looks the two can outwardly look very much the same, and I think there was one writer, maybe Benite, who thought that the Grand Coutumier was a coutume. But there's no actual evidence to actually back that particular theory up. So the key difference, I think, actually is the abrogation difference. But certainly the Grand Coutumier had an existence which was very, very similar to that of a coutume. In reality, if not in theory. I mean, the fact that in Thérien's days, his book on the customary law of Normandy was still a coutume was a commentary on a coutumier written 300 years ago, shows that it has a considerable longevity. And of course, the coutume itself, despite being a royal statute, nevertheless essentially has commentary built on it, albeit not in quite the same pedantic way as just writing Thérien writing comments on particular articles and the like. So both have a dynamic existence. So there are similarities, no differences. So if you have a question which says why is the distinction of importance, you do have to not just say, well, one's a law, one isn't. You've not really got much of an essay there, true as it is. You've also got to generally discuss the whole idea of how it's important and how far it's important. Does that make sense? So you can see in those few little ideas, few little questions, you can unwrap a whole lot of understanding of how the two work, how they're similar, how they're different. Is that fair?
Yes, I don't think there's a lot. I hate to have to write an essay on it because I don't think there's a whole lot to say.
It's more of a discussion.
Yeah.
It's more of a discussion question, and anything else. You couldn't really fill up 45 minutes or 36 minutes with that.
But like you see, the traits ancien coutumier drop away. It would have had a much longer life if it had been a coutume.
Yes.
So that becomes sort of superseded by the ancien coutume, by an informal process.
It could be, we don't know, but it could be nothing more than the fact that there was more versions of the Grand Coutumier published, or that maybe the rules in the Très Ancien Coutumier were inconvenient.
And I think didn't they hang on to the Grand Coutume for a lot longer? I think they resisted central authority imposing a reform on.
Well, the original
Norman identity.
Yeah, the original imposition on the customary law provinces was 1454.
Yeah.
And the Normans just ignored it.
They held on for a long time. So I think it tells you something about identity as well.
Yeah. And obviously when we talk about the Normans just ignored it, we're talking about the Normans that mattered, we're not talking about the peasants. Because ultimately we very easily start referring to this people and that people, but in the back of your mind there's the little bit of Bertolt Brecht, that you're kind of, are you really talking about the ordinary people in that? Well, the ones who had law and commerce were very much the elite in those days. So, describe the relative standing in Guernsey of the ancien coutume de Normandie and a coutume réformée. I mean, if you were to do this as an essay question...
That's an easier essay question.
But if you were to do it, what's the first thing you do? What is the first thing you do in this question? Sorry?
Define them.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That is the single most important thing in these sort of essays, is define your terms. And it's very easy to just just leap into the interesting parts of the discussion. But in actual fact, when you define your terms, often the answer falls out at the other end much more easily. So, how would you define your terms? Somebody on the left. Or somebody on the right. So, what is the ancien coutume de Normandie?
Are we talking about the très ancien
Man, no. No, it's the ancien coutume, the ancient custom of Normandy. Literally.
Is that what codified had previously been written?
Not quite. Okay, well maybe start with the coutume réformée and work your way back. Coutume réformée is easier. What's the coutume réformée?
The coutume réformée was where a body of different coutumiers were put into one body of writing.
Well, the coutume réformée, did it just look at previous coutumiers?
Didn't look at everything that was going on and try to codify it.
Yeah.
Well, if you take what Gordon says, that the Terrien is essentially the basis for the coutume réformée, that they drew heavily on the work of Terrien, who wrote in the early 1570s, and the coutume réformée is 1583, and there is a very strong relationship between Terrien and what goes in the coutume réformée. And you then ask yourself, well, what was Terrien writing about? And what Terrien was writing about was the Grand Coutumier as its application had developed in the following 300 and a bit years. You then begin to have your answer for what the two things mean. The coutume réformée is the official redaction of customary law as of 1583, or as compiled in the years immediately leading up to it, 1583. It represents the understanding of those who wrote it, who compiled it, of the state of customary law in Normandy. The ancien coutume de Normandie is basically the ancient customary law of Normandy, which is the customary law of Normandy as it existed, as it developed, as it changed, as it adapted, all the way up to when it gets redacted and codified. There is no year that you can say that is the ancient custom of Normandy, and what happened afterwards is just not ancient, because I'm not sure what that year would be. You have a très ancien coutumier, which is perhaps the easiest thing to get confused with, but the très ancien coutumier is a coutumier about the ancient custom written at the turn of the 13th century. The très ancien coutumier is a coutumier written about the ancient custom in the mid-13th century. The styles of procedure were written in the 14th to early 15th century about the très ancien coutumier by reference to the Grand Coutumier, which casts the enormous shadow all the way up to the coutume réformée and actually a bit beyond. And the gloss is the gloss on the Grand Coutumier. So the coutume the ancient custom of Normandy is the customary law of Normandy, which was substantially understood by reference to the Grand Coutumier, and developed in works afterwards, and as of the time of Terrian, it can be taken that Terrian was essentially writing down what the state of play was, whether it was clear, where it was unclear, where it was all over the shop, what discussions there were to be had at the time as to what it meant. So that's the ancient Coutume de Normandy, and then you get the Translation Coutumier, and then you've got a code. So when the code is clear, you no longer are in the business of trying to discuss necessarily what Terrian has to say on the subject. If it's less clear, when you have adaptations afterwards, then you...
I'm struggling a bit with the nomenclature, because in the first question we talked about obviously the difference between coutumier and coutume.
Okay.
And then when you say ancien coutume de Normandie, that's not written in the same way that coutume reformé.
No, a coutume.
You're just talking about the general body of
when
law as it's understood.
When you talk about coutume, as in just generally the concept of coutume as in customary law, then it just means the body of customary law. When you talk about a coutume, in the sense of a written document, then that is the reduction. And the phrasing is a little bit confusing, but it's important to get it into your head, because you can see that if you had a question like this, it would be very, very easy to misread it and write the entirely wrong answer down. And of course, there's nothing more fatal than writing the wrong answer down, because it means you're probably not going to show the relevant knowledge. You're not going to get marked highly on the essay that you thought you should be writing. So, the ancient customary of Normandy is everything before 1583. The Coutume Reformé and commentators on the Coutume Reformé, 1583 and afterwards.
Yeah, with Terrian being the best
expression. And Terrian is like the buckle between the two, because he's writing about the ancien coutume as then existing, and all the things that have been taken into the ancient, into Norman customary law, which, if you were to, draw your 1570s roadmap of Norman customary law, there would be parts where you'd say, well, this bit actually, we just adopted that from a French statute, or this bit we took from from Orleans, got nothing to do with the Grand Coutumier. Now, I think. And then the Coutume Reformé, ideally, would be a codified version of what Terrian said, resolving also, because the Grand Coutume is there to provide legal rules, not to discuss. It's there to say, do this, don't do this, not to say, well, the basic principles are these, and there's also this which causes trouble. So the Coutume Reformé is essentially building on Terrian and resolving the problems that existed at the time, because that's what legislatures are meant to do. When the customary law and the common law, when the case law and the statute are in a state of disarray, the role of legislation is to try and bring clarity. And the Coutume Reformé was precisely meant to bring clarity. When Henry III and his officials said, just do it, it was because of a lack of clarity, a lack of accessibility.
Where does L'Approbation then fit in between those two?
It doesn't, because it's in Guernsey.
Okay,
so when you're defining your terms, the ancien coutume de Normandie and the Coutume Reformé, you're talking about those two. Now, when you're talking about the relative standing, now you're talking about the Approbation.
Yeah, I mean, the ancien coutume de Normandie and the Coutume Reformé, these are Norman concepts. You're talking about Norman law. Norman law. And the terms of art, so the ancien coutume de Normandie, Dennis says, everything up to 1583.
Including
and L'Approbation is nothing. It's not. It's a Guernsey law construct.
Right, sure.
It's Guernsey law commenting, looking at defining Guernsey law by its Norman law. The concepts of the Coutume Reformé and ancien coutume de Normandie, those are purely Norman law things. Nothing to do with it's Guernsey looking in with L'Approbation. But if you're just looking at Norman law, it's the ancien coutume de Normandie and the Coutume Reformé, and L'Approbation, when they're asked what Guernsey law is, they look to Normandy. And curiously, don't wait for the coutume réformée. That's the oddity.
Yeah, but
They say, you know, they're writing 1582, 1581. It takes a year or so before it gets made an ordering council as a hiatus. So I guess they finished their work in Guernsey at the same time the work in Normandy wasn't finished, and it so happens it became an ordering council in 1583 within weeks of the time that the coutume réformée became law in Normandy.
Well, I mean, it's almost an accident.
Yeah.
And because one of the things to remember when you deal with the relationship between the Channel Islands and the United Kingdom is the United Kingdom authorities, whether it's under was the King of England back in the 13th and 14th centuries, or Queen Elizabeth's Privy Council, or even nowadays, by and large, aren't paying that much attention. So it may be very important for Guernsey, Jersey, and maybe thinking, well, what does the UK, what does England mean by that? But the answer is there's probably just some official who's not paying attention. And if somebody had been paying attention, they wouldn't have turned the response from Guernsey into an ordering council. And perhaps one of the reasons why they didn't wait for the coutume réformée is because they weren't actually conducting that sort of exercise at that time. And also, you never know. Given that the Normandy had ignored the request for almost 130 years, I mean, that they seemed to be doing something didn't necessarily mean they were going to get it done anytime soon, I suppose. But even so, it's a remarkable coincidence. And if they'd actually genuinely been seeing themselves as working towards producing a coutume, they probably would have said, "Hang on, let's wait." And we know there's stuff we can use. I'm not sure Anglo-French relations were that bad at that particular time, were they?
I don't think so. No, very good. Yeah. Julie had a question.
I'm still not clear what the actual standing of these two is in Guernsey, and I now know what they are.
Okay. How do you deal with the question of the relative standing of the two?
But you would define them, so we now know what they are.
Now know what they are. So, how do you deal with the relative standing? So, what is the standing of the two? So, what is the standing?
That's Julie's question.
It's trying to find out because they are not Guernsey law, so that we had this approbation at the same time or shortly before. So we have our own law, and
what is the approbation?
It's
Partial reduction.
Partial. You could say a partial redaction.
Scribbles on
partial redaction. It's an ordering council which gave a seal of law to a report on what Guernsey customary law was at the time. Is there anything about that report which links it to the Ancien Coutume de Normandie?
So Terrien is the buckle between
It's not just the buckle, but he's almost like in this sense he's like the what's the hub the spokes come out of. So he's buckling lots of things. Yes.
And so it's Terrien's commentary on the Ancien Coutume de Normandie that the Privy Council puts its stamp on. It's
the report. It's
a commentary on a commentary.
It's good. It's essentially commentary. It's the Commissioner's response
to Terrien
to the Privy Council question, which uses Terrien as its reference point to explain what is the customary law of Guernsey. Rather than do the job themselves, they basically want to say, well, it's that to this extent, this to that extent, not that, this. We can't be bothered to write it out ourselves. We're lazy. We want to go off and do some hunting. So something like that. It's the.
They look at Terrien and say, this is right, this is wrong, and then they put
the bits they agree with.
Yeah. It's a bit like if you've ever, if you've written an advice or something like that, and you know fully well you could explain it in greater detail, but you're tempted to try and just say, well, do it by reference to something else, and then you know in your heart you know you can't do that because you need to communicate it properly. Well, they didn't do that extra step. Otherwise, you get a very different sort of document. Otherwise, potentially you get the Guernsey version of the Costume Reformé, which actually at that particular time would probably have been the Costume Reformé to an overwhelming extent.
As they waited.
Although it has to be said that in Jersey, in the late 17th century, Poindexter said that only half the Costume Reformé was effectively applicable in Jersey. So we don't know what would have been the distinctions made because they just didn't do the job. So
then talking about the standing of the Costume Reformé in Guernsey, is it that it's persuasive as to what we look at?
Thanks for all.
yeah. So what you have, and you have to start it with what is the position of the Ancien Coutume in Guernsey. Well, the standing is that a large part of it was de facto ratified as being part of Guernsey law in a rough and ready sort of way.
Well, this is the 8th.
So Terrien, a lot of Terrien,
Terrien.
a lot of Terrien, and what is Terrien? Well, Terrien is a commentary on the Grand Coutumier. So that's relevant, albeit now more distant. So you have a highly authoritative state of play of the Ancien Coutume de Normandie being largely adopted as the state of play of Guernsey customary law, and given that royal seal, which means you can't or you shouldn't abrogate it. But
Okay.
treat it as repeal.
Yeah.
But you can flash forward to A versus R and say, but this didn't stop development in it, and there was nothing in the approbation to suggest that it would stop development. And then you say, how did it develop? And one of the ways was, as the world develops and as new questions are asked in new commercial circumstances and factual circumstances, the reality, as demonstrated by Laura Carey, is the Costume Reformé was referred to. And by this stage of your studies, you'll learn to be able to refer to one or two cases. You don't need to know what they're about, where the Costume Reformé has actually been used. So the Costume Reformé, the relative standing is lower than the Ancien Coutume de Normandie to the extent, certainly formally speaking, but it's perhaps more up to date.
So why do you say it's a lower standing than
Because it's difficult to get around the fact that Terrien is the one who's got the stamp from the approbation,
Right.
and it's Terrien who's the one who Le Marchant is commentating upon. But the Costume Reformé itself is referred to by Laurent Carey and was adopted to some extent. Or you might say you have the writers on the Costume Reformé, because what they're not simply doing is just translating, but they may simply do that because they do it in Jersey to some extent. But you have it working its way through a more informal channel with applying the Routier rule number 17. You can look abroad to try and get an idea of what's going on.
So it still has relevance.
It still has relevance.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It still has relevance, but
It doesn't have that stamp in the same
it doesn't
way.
have that stamp. It's essentially coming in the way that a customary law jurisdiction always, has a door open to outside influence. Whereas sometimes the answer that it's the rule in Terrien will come directly in the same way as if you were applying a statute, because if the approbation is clear, as the Marchant says, in creating a rule for Guernsey, then that is the rule, and that rule can come from nowhere else than the Ancien Coutume de Normandie, because that is what's being referred to in the approbation.
What about if there's a conflict between the two, between malabation and coutume?
Well, it's the approbation.
If that's the
if-
order.
Well, if you have a conflict in that, you know, you might think that the ordinary natural meaning of the approbation points one way, but the coutume is going in a different direction. It may be that the actual, you know, the approbation isn't sufficiently clear to close the door on development.
And also this like Jersey doesn't have an equivalent to l'approbation. So you have this flashbulb moment in Guernsey law in 1583 where you've got this order in council endorsing the bailiff and jurat's report to l'approbation, which, you know, is defining Guernsey law by reference to this. And so you have this moment in 1583, and that's why we have attach particular importance to the ancien coutume in the way that Jersey does it. It's more of a continuum for Jersey law, more seamless. But as time passes, that too becomes obsolescent, or you know, and the coutume reformé, they continue to look to Norman law for inspiration. So it's a subtle and evolving thing. It's not stuck in aspect, even though there's this order in council. And then I think you should be looking at the Code Civil as well. It's just, you know, you've got ancien coutume, the coutume reformé, 1804, and then the Code Civil. And I've always tried to push the Code Civil as the successor to all of that. So I don't think ever you should be stuck in the aspect of centuries gone by. I can't think of anything where you're really, really stuck in tyranny. All law moves on and on and on. Unless it's a very recent statute. And even then you still get nuances in case law.
Yeah.
So yes.
I mean, if you think about the Offences Against the Person Act in England and Wales, and they decide that causing mental injury can count as causing grievous bodily harm, even though it's not actually a physical injury to the brain, but actually the psychological scar can begin to do that. Again, that's clearly so 100% not